June 20th, 2001. Suburban Houston, Texas. A 36-year-old woman picks up the phone and dials 911. "I just killed my children," she says, almost like she's reporting a spill. Calm, composed, like it was already done, and no one could change it. When officers arrive, they find her waiting quietly by the door. Not crying, not running, just there. Inside the house, 5 children. A bathtub, silence. Andrea Yates had drowned them, one by one. From the youngest, just 6 months old, to her oldest, Noah, only 7. She would later tell investigators, "They weren't right with God. I had to save them." What followed was one of the most haunting criminal cases in American history. Not because of what she did, but because of what led her there. This isn't just the story of a crime. It's the story of a mind unraveling, of warning signs missed, of a system that saw the danger and still looked away. Today, we step into a tragedy that shook the world. The story of Andrea Yates. It was a quiet summer morning in Clear Lake, a residential suburb just outside Houston, Texas. The kind of neighborhood where lawns are trimmed, doors are left unlocked, and nothing truly bad ever seems to happen. Temperatures were already climbing. Birds chirped in the oak trees. At number 942 Beachcomber Lane, the Yates family's house sat still behind closed curtains. Inside, something unthinkable had just occurred. At exactly 9:48 am, a call came into the Harris County emergency line. The dispatcher answered with her usual tone. "Harris County 911. What's your emergency?" The voice on the other end belonged to a woman named Andrea Yates. She didn't sound panicked. She wasn't crying. She didn't stutter. "I need the police. I just killed my children." The dispatcher paused, unsure of what she'd just heard. Andrea repeated it, calm, clear, and horrifying. She gave her address, confirmed she was home alone, and then waited. There was no attempt to flee, no effort to hide done. The team stepped inside cautiously. Their faces were pale, their limbs limp. There were no bruises, no marks of resistance. Just beside them, still in the bathroom, was Mary, only 6 months old. Andrea had left her on a changing mat, clean, dressed, and lifeless. In the master bedroom, the horror continued. Laid out neatly on the bed were John, age 5, and Noah, age 7. Blankets had been pulled up over them, tucked in like bedtime. A final maternal gesture, or something far more unsettling. Later, investigators would determine the order of deaths. Andrea had drowned Mary first, the infant, then Luke, then Paul. She had laid their bodies out, one after the other. Then came John, and finally Noah, the oldest and the only one who fought back. He ran down the hallway, but Andrea chased him. She dragged him back into the bathroom and forced him under. Witnesses said there were scratches on the tub. Noah had fought to breathe. His last words, Andrea claimed, were, "Mommy, I'm sorry." Once it was done, she placed him on the bed with his brother. Then she picked up the phone and called the police. Outside, the street began to fill with squad cars, ambulances, and eventually media vans. Neighbors emerged in robes and slippers, staring in disbelief as officers cordoned off the yard. The Yates home, a modest brick house with flowers in the windows, had become a crime scene. Reporters didn't know what to say. How could they? A mother of 5 had just taken the lives of all her children, in her own home, with her own hands. And she admitted it without hesitation. When questioned, Andrea's words were eerily consistent. "I did it. I drowned them. They weren't right with God." She explained that the children were defiled by Satan, and that she needed to save them, not from harm, but from eternal damnation. That day, investigators didn't just step into a crime scene. They stepped into a psychological puzzle. Andrea hadn't lashed out in rage. There was no clear motive, no abuse, no financial desperation, no sudden trigger. She had acted with calm deliberation. She had waited until her husband, Rusty Yates, left for work. She had locked away the family dog so it wouldn't interfere. She had prepared the house. And then she had done what she later described as her duty. The medical examiner was called Child Services, Forensics. But behind every technical report and legal classification, one question kept rising. How does a mother reach that point? How does someone who once breastfed those children bathe them, kiss them goodnight, look at them and decide they must die? The media swarmed in, quickly painting Andrea Yates as a monster. But some weren't so sure. Some heard the words she used, heard the voices she claimed to hear, and wondered, not how could she, but why didn't someone stop her? She didn't cry. That was the first thing they noticed when Andrea Yates sat down in the interrogation room. No trembling, no shaking hands, no hysterics. She didn't even ask why she was there. She just looked straight ahead, her face pale and distant, like someone who had been staring at something unspeakable for hours. Maybe she had. This wasn't a woman in denial. It wasn't a woman trying to escape guilt or invent a story. No. Andrea Yates had already told the truth, the bare, unthinkable truth, when she picked up the phone and said, "I just drowned my children." Now she was sitting under harsh fluorescent lights, handcuffed, eyes sunken, hands folded neatly in her lap. If you didn't know what she'd done, you might think she was a nurse waiting for an interview. But what she was about to say would leave even seasoned homicide detectives unsure of what to believe, or even how to respond. The officer leaned forward. "Andrea, can you tell me why you did this?" She didn't hesitate. Because they were going to hell. That was it. No build-up. No roundabout answer. Just a soft, fragile voice stating something absolutely terrifying. She said it like it was the most obvious thing in the world. There was no mention of anger, no resentment, no cry for help. She didn't blame her husband. She didn't say she'd snapped. Instead, she spoke like a woman who believed she'd done something necessary, like a person who had fulfilled a grim duty. And that's when the officers realized this wasn't going to be a confession in the usual sense. This wasn't going to be about motive or provocation or some string of unfortunate events. This was going to be about belief, deep, terrifying belief. She wasn't hiding anything. On the contrary, she wanted to explain. "I was afraid for their souls," she said, her voice calm. "I was afraid they were being corrupted." Corrupted by what? Andrea didn't give a straight answer at first. She just kept saying they were in danger, that they were changing, that God had removed his protection from them. And then, after a long pause, she said the name, Satan, not as a metaphor, not as a figure of speech, but as a literal presence in her home, a being who, she believed, had targeted her children. "I listened to Satan," she said. "He was inside me. He was working through me." Now pause here. Let that sink in. A mother, sitting in a room less than 2 hours after drowning all 5 of her children, calmly telling detectives that Satan had spoken through her. And she says it without a flicker of doubt in her voice. Was it madness? Or something else? Could she truly believe this? And if she did, what does that say about our system? Our understanding of responsibility? One of the detectives, who had interviewed dozens of violent offenders, said later that he had never seen anything like it, not just because of the crime itself, but because of her demeanor. She wasn't trying to escape punishment. She wasn't bargaining. She wasn't even remorseful. She seemed satisfied, not happy, not relieved, but certain. "I saved them," she said. "Now they're safe." Imagine hearing that. Imagine looking into the eyes of a woman who has just ended the lives of 5 innocent children her own, and hearing her say she saved them. What would you do with that? They asked her how it happened, and she told them in painful detail, one by one. She described how she filled the bathtub, how she locked the dog away so it wouldn't interfere, how she called each child in turn, how she held them under, how she prayed while doing it. She didn't shy away from the horror. She didn't embellish it either. She just described it like a nurse reporting on a patient's death. Clinical, clean, resigned. And every time they asked her why, she gave the same answer: to save them. Not from poverty, not from abuse, not from her husband, but from damnation. In her mind, these weren't murders. They were acts of salvation, and that made it all the more chilling. It would be easier, more comfortable to call her evil, a monster. But monsters don't usually talk about redemption. Monsters don't weep silently for the fate of souls. Andrea didn't cry during the interrogation, but her eyes did glaze over when she spoke about her children's spirits, as if they were still floating somewhere just out of reach, as if she had done something irreversible but righteous. And that's where the horror deepened. Because if she believed that what she did was right, if she truly believed she had saved her children, then what does punishment even mean? One of the detectives asked her, "Do you understand that killing your children is against the law?" Andrea nodded. "Yes." "Do you understand that you may go to prison?" Again, she nodded. "Yes." "Then why did you do it anyway?" There was no hesitation in her reply. "Because saving their souls was more important than saving my life." That line broke the room. The officers weren't angry. They weren't shouting. They weren't confused. They were just devastated. Because how do you respond to a confession like that? How do you respond to someone who doesn't think she's guilty because in her mind she's done the most merciful thing a mother can do? They pressed harder. Was there abuse at home? Was her husband involved? Had she experienced a psychotic break? Andrea was consistent. There was no abuse, no recent trauma, no external pressure, only spiritual warfare. She believed she had been failing her children by allowing them to live, that the world was too dangerous, that Satan was using her to corrupt them, and that drowning them was the only way to stop it. She even described dreams, warnings, signs. She said God had given her one more chance to do the right thing, that he had tested her, and this time she couldn't fail. Not again. That phrase, "not again," stuck with one of the detectives, because it suggested something deeper, something lingering in the background that they didn't yet understand. But they didn't press further that night. They had enough, more than enough. When the interrogation ended, the room was silent. One officer stayed seated, staring at the table. Another stood and rubbed his temples. No one wanted to be the first to speak. It wasn't just that a mother had killed her children. That happens, tragically, more than we'd like to admit. It was that she'd done it believing she was doing something holy. That kind of conviction terrifies people, because it doesn't fit into any neat box. It's not temporary insanity. It's not cold calculation. It's something else entirely. It's delusion dressed as faith. And the law isn't built to handle that. The detectives filed their reports, stunned by the lack of motive. There was no financial gain, no abuse, no drugs, no evidence of coercion. Andrea had acted alone, with full awareness of what she was doing, and yet no malice, just belief. Word leaked to the media within 24 hours. One reporter overheard a conversation at the station. Soon, headlines were everywhere. Mother kills 5 to save them from Satan. Texas woman claims devil made her do it. Religious horror. Mom says murders were spiritual mercy. And just like that, the country was no longer asking, what happened? It was asking, why? Why didn't anyone see this coming? Why did no one intervene? Why did this woman think she had to kill her children to protect them? And perhaps the hardest question of all, was she insane? Or just convinced? The legal system was about to face that very dilemma. But for now, the investigation was complete. Andrea had confessed. She had explained everything. She had sat in that cold, bright room and told the truth as she saw it. But what kind of truth was it? A mother who killed out of love. A woman who listened to voices no one else could hear? A tragedy born not from hate, but from faith, twisted by illness? Whatever the answer, one thing was clear. No one in that room would ever forget what they heard that night. And the case of Andrea Yates had only just begun. The courtroom was quiet. You could almost hear the breath of every spectator as Andrea Yates was led inside small, pale, wrapped in a beige cardigan that seemed to drown her frame. Her head was slightly bowed, not in shame perhaps, but in exhaustion. Or was it surrender? This was the moment America had been waiting for. 5 dead children, a bathtub, a mother who confessed without blinking. And now justice? But what kind of justice do you seek when the killer is the mother? When her hands had once cradled those same children to sleep? Is this justice about punishment? Or is it about comprehension? The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a portrait of cold, methodical murder. They showed the timeline. Andrea had waited until her husband left for work. She had locked the dog away. She had drowned each of her children one by one, in cold water, without flinching. They stressed the deliberation, the calculation. And this is where the battle lines were drawn. Was Andrea Yates a monster, or was she sick? The defense argued she was severely mentally ill, that this was not murder in the conventional sense, but the consequence of a collapsing mind. They brought in medical records, prescriptions, expert witnesses. Andrea had been diagnosed with postpartum psychosis. She had been hospitalized twice. She had attempted suicide. She believed she was damned and that her children were too. She truly, profoundly believed she was saving them. But was that enough? Because what the law demands in a trial like this is not just evidence of mental illness, but proof that the illness abolished her sense of right and wrong. It's a fine legal line, thin as a razor and just as brutal. The jury had to decide. Did she know what she was doing was wrong? One piece of testimony stood out. Andrea had waited until her husband left. She had called the police. She had confessed, calmly. The prosecution seized on this. If she understood the consequences, didn't that mean she understood the morality? But the truth isn't always logical, and psychosis doesn't follow courtroom rules. What if she called the police because she thought she'd done the right thing? What if, in her mind, her actions were divinely mandated? Isn't that more terrifying than premeditated murder? One psychiatrist, Dr. Park Dietz, testified that Andrea had been watching episodes of Law and Order, and that in one of them, a mother had drowned her children and was declared not guilty by reason of insanity. He claimed Andrea used that episode as a model. That testimony devastated the defense. Because if Andrea had watched an episode about using mental illness to escape conviction, didn't that suggest manipulation? A woman who calculated her crime based on a legal loophole? But there was a problem. That episode never existed. It was fiction, fabricated in the mind of an expert witness. Yet the damage was done. The jury never heard the correction. The prosecution had planted the seed, and it had taken root. So Andrea was found guilty of capital murder. Not insane, not delusional, just responsible. And she was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years. 40 years. By then, her children would have been in their 40s too, living lives she never allowed them to live. As the verdict was read, Andrea showed no emotion. She didn't cry. She didn't protest. Some said it proved her guilt. Others said it proved her illness. And outside the courthouse, America was split down the middle. Some were outraged. She should get the death penalty. What kind of justice is this? Others were haunted. She needed help. How did the system fail so badly? But maybe the more important question is this: who is this trial really for? Andrea had already destroyed herself. Her body was alive, but her mind had imploded. She wasn't fighting for freedom. She wasn't fighting at all. The real purpose of the trial was for us, the public, the nation, to look this horror in the face and ask, how do we explain the inexplicable? How do we categorize a mother who kills not out of hatred, but out of love distorted by madness? And more disturbingly, how many others are out there, suffering silently, unraveling slowly, because no one is watching close enough? Andrea Yates went to prison, but the story didn't end there, because a trial can deliver a verdict, but not always the truth. And as we'd later learn, some truths refuse to stay buried. There are cases where the verdict brings closure, where justice wraps things up in a neat, grim little package and allows everyone to move on. This wasn't one of them. Andrea Yates had been found guilty. She was behind bars. Her story to many was over, but not to the legal system, and not to those who still believed that something had gone terribly wrong, not just in that bathtub, but in that courtroom. Because behind the heavy prison doors, something was unraveling. Andrea wasn't adjusting to incarceration. She wasn't adapting. She was disintegrating. She stopped speaking, refused food, spent days lying motionless, her eyes vacant, her mouth twitching with whispered thoughts, none of them of this world. Doctors who saw her behind bars reported one consistent thing: she was still sick, chronically, deeply, dangerously, and perhaps always had been. And then came the discovery that changed everything. That devastating piece of testimony from forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz, the so-called Law and Order episode about a mother who drowned her children and was found not guilty by reason of insanity. It didn't exist. There was no such episode. None. The expert had misremembered, or worse, invented it entirely. And yet, the jury had heard it. They had taken it into account. They had used it to judge Andrea's intent, and therefore, her sanity. That mistake, that lie, shattered the verdict. In 2005, nearly 4 years after the killings, Andrea Yates was granted a retrial. And now, everything was different. This time, the defense leaned fully into her mental illness. There were no distractions, no manufactured TV references, no grandstanding. Only the cold, clinical reality of a woman whose mind had betrayed her completely. They brought in new psychiatrists. They presented clearer timelines of her medical history, the suicide attempts, the religious delusions, the terrifying postpartum breakdowns. And most of all, they emphasized the disconnect from reality. Andrea hadn't acted with a criminal mind. She'd acted with a shattered one. She truly believed Satan had claimed her children, that their only hope was death, that if they lived, they would suffer eternally, that by killing them, she was saving them. Horrifying? Absolutely, but not criminal in the way the law defines it. And this time, the jury agreed. In July 2006, Andrea Yates was found not guilty by reason of insanity. The verdict didn't absolve her. It didn't celebrate her. It simply acknowledged the reality. She was not well. She was sent, not to prison, but to a high-security mental health facility, Childre State Hospital in Texas. And let me ask you, is that a victory? Is justice served when a woman who killed her 5 children is removed from society, not to be punished, but to be healed? Can you heal from this? Can a mother ever live with the memory of her child's final breath beneath her hands? Or is this hospital simply a cleaner kind of cage? At Childre, Andrea was finally given consistent psychiatric care, medication, monitoring, a structure designed not to punish, but to stabilize. And slowly, painfully, she began to speak again. But not of the killings. She spoke of her children. Their names, their habits, their smiles. She drew pictures of them, talked about how Noah loved books, how Mary would cling to her legs, how Paul, always sensitive, cried when his siblings were hurt. She remembered everything. She was no longer in psychosis, but she was not at peace. And maybe she never will be. People often ask, is she sorry? The answer, by every doctor's account, is yes, crushingly so. Andrea Yates feels the weight of what she's done every single day. Her sanity returned, but her grief remained. And maybe that's the cruelest twist of all. Because for a time, madness shielded her from the magnitude of her actions. But sanity? Sanity brought the full horror rushing back. Every morning, she wakes up in that hospital. She breathes. She walks the sterile halls. She takes her meds. And she remembers. Her punishment isn't the law. It's memory. Some have called for her release over the years. Others demand she rot in that institution forever. But Andrea has never asked to leave. Not once. She knows what she did. She knows who she was. And maybe the most honest thing she can do now is stay exactly where she is. No freedom, no interviews, no redemption arc. Just silence, just survival, just the slow, quiet ticking of time in a place built for the broken. Before she became the woman who drowned her 5 children in a bathtub, Andrea Yates was something else entirely. She was a daughter, a student, an achiever, a woman who wanted to do good. And maybe, in some dark, twisted part of her mind, she still believed she was. Andrea Pia Kennedy was born on July 2nd, 1964, in Hallsville, Texas, the youngest of 5 children in a deeply conservative Catholic family. She was quiet, shy, but not broken, not yet. At school, she stood out not socially, but academically. Straight A student, National Honor Society. She was the kind of girl who never gave anyone trouble. The kind of girl teachers remembered for all the right reasons. And behind her thick glasses and reserved demeanor, there was a razor-sharp mind. She excelled in math and science. She wanted to become a nurse, and she pursued it with the same fierce focus she brought to everything else. Andrea graduated from Milby High School in Houston in 1982 as class valedictorian. From there, she enrolled in the University of Texas School of Nursing. She graduated with honors. It's almost uncomfortable, isn't it, to hear about her like this? As if success could protect someone from what was coming. As if intelligence was some kind of vaccine against tragedy. But Andrea wasn't just smart, she was disciplined. She worked at the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, one of the most prestigious hospitals in the country, in the intensive care unit. Her job was grueling, high pressure, life and death. She managed it with quiet precision. But even then, something was starting to form beneath the surface. Her coworkers described her as reserved, not unfriendly, but distant, focused. She wasn't the type to join in the jokes at the nurse's station or linger after hours. There was a weight to her, a solemnity, but no one saw a warning sign. Why would they? The quiet girl who never missed a shift, who followed every protocol, who never raised her voice, that's not the one you worry about. But maybe you should. In 1989, everything changed. Andrea met Russell "Rusty" Yates at the apartment complex where they both lived. Rusty was a computer engineer working for NASA. He was charming, ambitious, and devout. They shared a love of order, of structure, of moral clarity. Some say it was love at first sight. Others say it was need. 2 people looking for something solid to hold on to. They moved in together almost immediately. But Andrea, raised Catholic, insisted on marrying before anything went further. Rusty agreed. They married in April 1993, and from there, something shifted. The couple made a vow, not just to each other, but to a life of radical simplicity. Influenced by the teachings of a traveling preacher named Michael Warrenetsky, they turned toward a fundamentalist interpretation of Christianity, one that viewed modern life, television, materialism, even friendships as corrupting influences. Salvation, they believed, came through self-denial, through obedience, through total devotion to God's plan. They dreamed of having a quiver full of children, a reference to Psalm 127. Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth. Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. 5 children, maybe more, raised in purity, homeschooled, shielded from the world. At first, it seemed idyllic. Andrea stopped working. She embraced the role of homemaker with the same intensity she once brought to her studies. The house was spotless. Meals were prepared on time. The children, one after another, were born healthy, bright-eyed, and obedient. But beneath that surface of perfection, something else was festering. They moved often, chasing Rusty's contracts and trying to live out their minimalist, God-centered ideal. At one point, they lived in a converted bus. Andrea had no friends, no outside support, no breaks. Just diapers, breastfeeding, cleaning, praying, and repeating. The children were spaced barely a year apart. Her body was constantly recovering from one pregnancy while entering another. And with each birth, her world narrowed. Did Rusty see it? Did he notice how pale she became? How she stopped smiling? How sometimes she'd just sit and stare, unmoving, for hours? He says he didn't, or that he did, but didn't realize what it meant. By the time their fourth child, John, was born in 1999, Andrea was no longer coping. She was surviving. But the outside world saw something else. A devout, modest wife. A supermom. A woman who had rejected the chaos of the modern world in favor of a pure, holy mission. Isn't that how so many stories like this begin? With someone who seems to have it all together? Someone we admire for their strength. Until we realize it wasn't strength at all. It was silence. The fall didn't come suddenly. It crept in, like fog rolling through a valley slow, dense and almost imperceptible, until everything is lost in gray. After the birth of her fourth child, something inside Andrea broke. She began to have hallucinations, dark visions, voices. She believed cartoons on TV were speaking directly to her, sending her messages. She stopped eating. She pulled out her own hair in clumps. She would sit for hours, hunched over, silent, staring into nothing. And yet, she told no one, because she thought she was supposed to suffer. That suffering meant something. That her pain was part of God's plan. That if she just tried harder, prayed harder, denied herself more completely, she would be cleansed. But eventually, her mind couldn't keep up the illusion. In June 1999, Rusty came home to find Andrea shaking, incoherent. She had attempted to take her own life by overdosing on pills. That was the first hospitalization. The first time professionals got a glimpse behind the curtain. She was diagnosed with severe postpartum depression and psychosis. A second suicide attempt came just days after her release, when she tried to slit her own throat. Back to the hospital. More medications, more silence. She was prescribed Haldol, a powerful antipsychotic. And it helped, briefly. With treatment, Andrea seemed to stabilize. The darkness receded partially. Enough for doctors to consider her condition manageable. Enough for Rusty to believe she was well enough to come home. Enough even for her to convince herself that she could have another child. But what no one seemed to question, at least, not forcefully enough, was whether this woman, this profoundly ill woman, should be pregnant again. Whether her body, her mind, could withstand another descent. Andrea went off her medication, deliberately, because she believed it interfered with her ability to be a good mother, because the doctrine she followed taught that faith should be stronger than medicine, that demons could not be exorcised by pills. She stopped seeing her psychiatrist, and in November 2000, her fifth child, Mary, was born. She was beautiful, serene, the only girl. But her arrival marked the beginning of the final unraveling. Andrea was no longer merely depressed, she was delusional. Her thoughts became soaked in religious symbolism. She began to believe that she was destined for damnation, that her children were too sinful to be saved, that Satan had taken hold of her, and through her would destroy them all. Michael Wernitzky's newsletters didn't help. The preacher who had once inspired the couple's faith was now sending mail that reinforced Andrea's worst fears. His letters warned against the dangers of modern motherhood. He preached that women were easily led by Satan, that failure to submit fully to God's authority was failure. Andrea took it all in, line by line, word for word. Rusty, meanwhile, remained convinced that she just needed more support, more prayer, more time. He still left her alone with the children. He still encouraged her to homeschool, despite doctors' recommendations to place the children in daycare, even temporarily. He believed Andrea just needed to find her strength again, to choose joy, to fight the darkness with faith. But this wasn't sadness anymore. This was psychosis. Andrea began to believe that she had irrevocably failed her children, that their souls were already marked, that the only way to save them was to send them to God before Satan could fully claim them. She wrote notes, made plans, hid her intentions under the veil of obedience. To the outside world, she remained quiet, dutiful, pale and exhausted, yes, but composed. She still fed the children, still washed the dishes, still wore her hair tied back neatly in the way Rusty preferred. But behind her eyes, the war had already begun. When Andrea's father died in March 2001, her fragile stability collapsed completely. He had been her one emotional anchor, her confidant, her last thread to the world outside her home and her faith. After his death, she stopped speaking, stopped smiling, stopped sleeping. Her condition was now openly alarming. And yet, Rusty believed that she just needed to be left alone, to grieve, to heal. So on the morning of June 20th, 2001, he kissed her goodbye and left for work. Andrea was alone with 5 children, a locked bathroom, and a bathtub filling slowly with water. It began as a whisper, a low hum beneath the surface, easy to ignore, easy to dismiss. Andrea was tired, of course, she was tired. 4 children under the age of 6 will do that to you. Long nights, sore bodies, endless noise. Any mother might drift, might forget, might sit at the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, just needing a moment. That's what they thought it was, at first. Just a moment, but it wasn't. After the birth of her 4th child, Luke, in February 1999, something shifted inside Andrea. Not a crack, something more subtle, more dangerous. A quiet implosion, the kind you don't see until it's too late. She grew silent, detached, not sad, not angry, just distant. At times she'd sit on the floor, legs crossed, staring at nothing. Hours would pass. The children would play, cry, tug at her clothes, and she would not respond. Rusty chalked it up to exhaustion. He worked long hours, and Andrea managed everything at home. Maybe she just needed rest. But soon, the silence turned into something darker. She began to mutter to herself, strange things, religious things, words about sin and punishment, about damnation, about being marked. Rusty would ask her what she meant, and she'd look at him with glassy eyes, as if he were a stranger. In June 1999, She took a knife and held it to her neck. Rusty managed to take it from her before she could act. She told him she wanted to die. That same month, she overdosed on pills. It was not a cry for help. It was a genuine attempt to leave this world. She survived. They took her to a hospital. The doctors labeled it postpartum psychosis, a severe form of mental illness triggered by childbirth. They prescribed Haldol, an antipsychotic. Her condition improved, but only briefly. 2 weeks later, Andrea was released. Back home, back to the same environment that had nearly swallowed her whole. There was no nurse, no therapist coming daily, no structured plan. Just Rusty, the children, and a woman slipping into shadows. The episodes returned. One afternoon, Rusty found her biting her own fingers, bloodied and shaking. She said she had to cleanse herself. Another time, she slashed her scalp with a sharp object, whispering that the devil was trying to get inside her head. Andrea was hospitalized again in July, then again in August. Each time she was stabilized temporarily and sent back home. Her diagnosis hovered between bipolar disorder and schizophrenia. Some doctors thought it was a mixture of both, but all agreed Andrea was dangerously unwell. Her reality was warping. She was beginning to believe things that weren't true, things that terrified her. She began obsessively reading the Bible, not just for comfort, but for punishment. She fixated on verses about sin, obedience, fire, and brimstone. She began to believe she was damned, that her children were too. Dr. Eileen Starbranch, one of her psychiatrists, grew increasingly alarmed. After several evaluations, she delivered a stern, clear warning to the Yates family. Andrea must not have another child. Her mind was too fragile. Another pregnancy could shatter her completely. Rusty nodded. He listened, but somehow, just a few months later, Andrea was pregnant again. How does something like that happen? Was it carelessness? Denial? Faith? Andrea and Rusty were part of a religious circle that believed birth control was sinful. Children were gifts from God. Be fruitful and multiply. Even in the midst of psychological crisis, the pressure to obey was there. Quiet, constant, absolute. Andrea did not resist. Her body became a battleground again. She carried her fifth child under the crushing weight of psychosis and unhealed trauma. Her belly grew, but so did the darkness inside her. She stopped laughing. She stopped smiling. She rarely spoke. Mary Yates was born on November 30th, 2000. A tiny, healthy baby girl, perfect in every way. And her mother was gone. Not physically, but emotionally, psychologically, spiritually. Andrea had nothing left. She had done what was expected of her. She had brought another soul into the world. But there was no joy, no light, just a creeping dread that wouldn't leave. She tried to function. She bathed the children. She made meals. She read scripture. She did everything she was supposed to do. But inside, she was unraveling. Every day, the voices grew louder. They told her she was a bad mother, that her children were doomed, that she had failed, that hell awaited. Sometimes she resisted. Sometimes she didn't. In March 2001, Andrea stopped taking her medication. She believed she was healed, that God had touched her, that the devil had been driven out. But the devil was still there. In April, she had another breakdown. She begged Rusty to let her die. She stopped eating. She refused to bathe. She pulled out chunks of her hair. Her psychiatrist pleaded with Rusty. Hospitalize her. He did. But just weeks later, she was home again. There was no long-term care. No psychological rehabilitation. No team of experts. Just a house full of children. And a mother, hollowed out by delusion and despair. One day, Andrea wrote in her journal, "I am evil. I have failed. My children are not righteous. I must save them." She didn't believe in healing anymore. She believed in judgment. She believed that death was the only redemption left. Mary was barely 6 months old. When we look back on the tragic story of Andrea Yates, it's tempting to want a simple answer. Was she crazy? Was she a fanatic? Was she simply a monster? But reality rarely offers such clean conclusions. Andrea Yates was neither purely mad nor purely malevolent. She was a woman caught at the crossroads of mental illness, faith, and a society that failed to see her pain until it was too late. Was she insane? Yes. Diagnosed with severe postpartum psychosis, bipolar disorder, and schizophrenia by different experts, her mental health was shattered. The voices she heard, the delusions she lived with, these were symptoms of an illness that no one could fully control or cure. Was she a fanatic? In some sense, yes. The ultra-conservative religious beliefs she and her husband embraced created a framework where suffering was sanctified and silence was golden. Motherhood became an absolute duty, unquestioned and glorified. Birth control was forbidden, mental illness misunderstood or dismissed as a test of faith. But she was also a victim of her mind. Yes, but also of a medical system that repeatedly failed to provide adequate support. Of a social fabric that praises motherhood as sacred, but rarely offers real protection or understanding when things go wrong. This story exposes deep, uncomfortable truths. How many women like Andrea fall through the cracks each year? How many silently suffer, hidden behind smiles, waiting for help that never arrives? The American healthcare system struggles with postpartum mental health. Screening is inconsistent. Support networks are weak. Stigma remains a massive barrier. And beyond medicine, there is the cultural myth of the perfect mother, the woman who manages it all with grace, who never cries out, who sacrifices endlessly and alone. This myth is dangerous. It silences those who need help most. It isolates them. It leaves them vulnerable. Andrea's tragedy urges us to ask, how can we do better? Early detection is crucial. Family members, partners, doctors all need to be educated to recognize the signs of postpartum psychosis and depression. Support systems must be accessible and affordable. Mental health must be normalized, not stigmatized. And faith communities, often a source of strength, must also become sources of compassion and understanding, not judgment and silence. Could Andrea's story have ended differently? We cannot know for sure. But if this video teaches us anything, it's that mental illness is complex, multifaceted, and devastating, and it demands our attention. Andrea Yates' case continues to provoke debate about responsibility, punishment, and compassion in the criminal justice system. Was she a criminal? A patient? Both? And what does that say about how we treat mental illness in society? In the end, Andrea's story is not just about one woman's tragedy. It is a mirror reflecting the gaps in our healthcare, our social values, and our humanity. By confronting this uncomfortable mirror, we take the first step toward preventing future tragedies. Because every mother deserves help, every child deserves protection, and every story, no matter how dark, deserves to be told with honesty, empathy, and understanding.